Greetings, everyone. This is Eric Glazer, and welcome to another episode of Bright Spots in Healthcare, produced by Shared Purpose Connect. We bring leaders together to not only inform you, but also unearth bright spots, successes at health plans, hospitals, and other healthcare-related organizations around the country. Our goal is to identify as many bright spots as possible so that you can determine if the ideas shared on this episode can be applied at your organization. We believe that this approach of finding a bright spot and cloning it is the most effective strategy to improving healthcare in our lifetime. My team wants to remind you to please rate and review this podcast. If you're not a subscriber, certainly click subscribe. Also scroll down, Spotify, Google Play, Apple. Give us the star ratings you think we deserve. If you have any complimentary comments to add to the comment section, all this helps your peers more easily find this episode and get access to all the experts' bright spots that they share so that we can make healthcare better for everyone around the country. During today's episode, we're going to talk about a super exciting topic to me personally, in and around mental health. We're going to talk about the efficacy and safety of psychedelics and how they are being applied in practice and the potential pharmacoeconomic or business impact this category of medications can have on everyone's businesses listening today. And our guest today is Dr. Alex Belser. Dr. Belser is a clinical scientist, an author, a teacher, and a licensed psychologist. He has been a leader in psychedelic research over the last 20 years. He has received his education and training at Georgetown University, Cambridge University, Columbia University, New York University, and Yale University. Currently, he's the co-investigator for a study investigating how psilocybin therapy could help people with OCD being held at Yale University. He is passionate about this type of therapy, and he teaches in a number of psychedelic therapy training programs. With Dr. Bill Brennan, he created the Embark program, EMBARK, if you want to Google that. It's a new model of psychedelic assisted therapy. He has a book about Embark published by Oxford University Press coming out later this year. In Alex's role as a researcher, he has been a researcher in more than a dozen clinical trials, which has explored the potential of novel therapies using psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, and DMT to treat depression, anxiety, addiction, and PTSD. In 2006, Dr. Belser co-founded the NYU Psychedelic Research Group and more recently co-founded Nautilus Sanctuary, the first 501c3 non-for-profit, I guess that's redundant, on the East Coast dedicated to psychedelic medicine. His research and work has been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Guardian, Rolling Stone magazine, the Atlantic, and Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. To learn more, you can check out Dr. Belser at Alex Belser. I'll spell that for you, AlexBelser.com, or his practice website, which is the centerforbreakthroughs.com, centerforbreakthroughs.com, one word. So Alex, thanks for joining me. Welcome to Bright Spots in Healthcare.
Thanks for having me, Eric. It's nice to be on.
I want to start because I know everyone is maybe curious. There could be some skeptics listening. Like, why does psychedelics work and why wouldn't it work? Let's just start there and then we'll get into some of the applications and some of the bright spots.
Yeah, I'm almost as surprised as anyone that it's gotten as much attention, and there's been this groundswell of interest in psychedelics over the last 5 years in particular. The reason there's interest is that it has been working and it could be efficacious for a number of different disorders that have to this point been hard to treat, like depression, anxiety, addiction, OCD. One of the things that's happened is that academic centers across the world have sprung up, getting funding for doing this kind of research. A huge industry boom has gone from a $0 industry to a multi-billion-dollar industry in the last 4 years. And, the number of papers being published in psychedelic trials, it used to be that we would pour over these papers, once a season. Now they're coming out 5 or 6 a day. It's hard to even just keep up with what's being put on the docket. Psychedelics may work through a variety of different means, and their mechanisms are not very well known, not yet anyway. Neurobiologically, they're active, like psilocybin, for example, if you look at the chemical structure, is extremely similar to serotonin. Same thing with DMT. They're active at the 5-HT2A receptor site. They are associated with mood, but there's a whole controversy of different ways in which they may work. What we have seen is that they do work. We've seen, at least in these early phase 2 and now multi-site trials, efficacious, significant reductions in depression, anxiety, alcohol use disorder, and some promising and preliminary evidence in OCD and a variety of other indications.
Could you I don't want to talk down to the audience. I'm sure there's enough people listening that have some sort of basic clinical knowledge at a high level. But I want to talk a little bit about what you just said about psilocybins are similar to serotonin. Can you explain that a little bit? Because I want to be careful we don't get too technical here, and I want to make sure everyone understands what you mean by that.
Right. So if you actually put the molecules side by side, they're very, they look very much alike. What's interesting about psilocybin is that there's a number of competing arguments as to why it might help from a neurobiological perspective. So one of the things that happens.
One more thing.
Oh, yeah.
Serotonin, though, let's level set for folks that don't understand how important serotonin is to just illnesses above the neck and how chemicals are used to manage that to help with people struggling with all the diseases you just mentioned.
Yeah. Well, one of the canards of psychiatry over the last 20 years is this idea that people who are depressed don't have enough good brain chemicals, right? They have a lack of transmitters, including serotonin, which seems to be critical in mood. And so the idea for SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, is they would say, well, let's use an inhibitor to keep more serotonin in the brain, and that might be the mechanism by which people seem to feel, some people sometimes, although maybe not enough, feel better when they take SSRIs and they have been depressed. The problem with this has been that it's been thoroughly debunked. It's probably not actually, it's a nice story, but it's not probably the actual mechanism by which we don't actually have evidence to suggest that people who are depressed have less serotonin, and SSRIs may work through a variety of other mechanisms. So there's still a little bit of a mystery as to how this is all playing out. And I think, I'll leave it to the neuropsychopharmacologists and brain imaging experts to come on your podcast and really explain the details of it. What's interesting with psychedelics is that there's a few things that we do know seem to be happening and might be associated with benefit for patients. Yeah. So for example, one of the things that happens with psilocybin, and look, everyone's heard the story of people taking LSD and they have synesthesia. Someone plays music and they can see the music, or someone, they hear sounds. There's a crossover. The actual regions of the brain, which are usually balkanized, I'm sort of pointing to, if you imagine your skull, are actually firing in interesting and new ways. There's a lot of functional neuroconnectivity, which may be associated with changing and opening a new critical learning window. This idea that psychedelics could be learning agents, that they promote neuroplasticity, that they are associated with the growth literally of new synapses, and especially synaptogenesis, synaptic connection, which is where neurons that fire together wire together in the brain. And so someone who has ruminative depression, who has like a really deep rut, a wheel well, they're always on the same loop over and over again, they're ruminating. It's easier to get out of that rut and learn a new cognitive scheme. Like, I don't know, like I'm going to go for a bicycle ride instead of sitting, on my lazy boy and just sort of thinking about how ashamed I am. But there's other means too. So psychedelics are associated with the turning offline of something called the default mode network. When you go into the scanning machine, they usually give people tasks, right? It's like, okay, like now solve this pass, let's scan your brain and see what happens. But they noticed that when they stopped giving people tasks, they weren't giving them any assignment. They still had brain activity, and they called that the default mode. The default mode network was this sort of like activity in the brain. And we think it's associated with ideas of the self, of the ego, of self-referential activity. And oftentimes it's associated with self-reverie, daydreaming, but also sort of like a rigid sense of who I am, like I am this person. With psychedelics, the DMN goes offline. And so it turns down. And so this idea that mental health may be associated with like a rigid set of identities that are hard to change or grow or adapt, including from maladaptive to adaptive ways of being, is opened up. And then lastly, there's other ways that it might work. All of this, by the way, is preliminary, and we'll get to the reasons why it does not work or could not work in a second. But people under psychedelic medicine in supportive contexts have, unsurprisingly, you've heard about it, like big experiences. They have huge cathartic feelings. I've worked with patients that are weeping for like an hour and like really processing something. They may approach a traumatic event in our MDMA trials for severe PTSD that they were unable to approach before. They have experiences of themselves in the world that are existentially or spiritually meaningful, including profound experiences of sense of unity, transcendence of time and space. People have, non-ordinary consciousness, as you would expect with drugs like psilocybin or LSD or MDMA. And these seem to be, in scientific models, mediating or basically predicting benefits, symptom reductions in depression, anxiety, smoking cessation, people trying to get off nicotine, alcohol use disorder. So there's a lot of interest in the area, including the psychological mechanisms. But there's also a lot of reasons why it, may not translate into our healthcare system or may not work beyond these early trials once we get into larger multi-site trials or into the community.
I'd be curious. I want to go there because I do think we have to make sure this is balanced. I know, like I have, and I don't know if any of our listeners have any either personal experience or direct once removed experience with psilocybin, but I have a friend of mine who, we'll say 10 plus years ago, after a number of failed treatments in some high-end addiction, inpatient addiction facilities, took it upon himself against my advice and his brother, who was a physician's advice, to go to Mexico to a clinic, an ibogaine clinic, which is psilocybin or psychedelic, right? And not only, like you said, did it open up, I think, all opportunities for therapy and unpack some things. He has been, I don't want to say cured, you're always an addict, but he has been essentially a perfect citizen for 10 plus years. It saved his life and his family. So it's an N of one, but I'm curious, it's clearly working for people in certain settings. It's clearly working for people, right?
That's right, yeah.
And so,
and the key is in certain settings, because if everybody who was depressed or anxious and just took psilocybin just got better, everyone who went to a Grateful Dead concert or a Fish show would not suffer from anxiety and depression, and we know that that is not the case. So a certain setting is that these medications have a lot of preparatory work with two therapists, and they have a lot of integration work afterward to help translate altered states into altered traits in their life and new behaviors and habits. So it's not just a one-off, right? It's something different than a recreational setting. And the ibogaine treatment that you're describing, which is particularly efficacious potentially for opioid cessation and people trying to kick the habit for opioids and potentially other addictive behaviors, is really promising. It's a complex drug, but it's a really interesting set of drugs in that class of compounds. Yeah.
So why wouldn't psychedelics work? Let's talk about that for a little bit before we get into application.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that, we were talking about before the call is that psychedelics have been, we're still in phase 1, phase 2, a few phase 3 research. And as this goes along, what we're seeing is really strong effect sizes, really strong response rates, but it may not translate to the community. So for example, I was involved with a trial as a therapist that MAPS is sponsoring, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. It's treating PTSD, and not just PTSD, but severe PTSD. And in that trial, after a year, it's a very intense intervention. There's dozens of hours of therapy, 3 sessions with MDMA, a whole treatment team. But people with severe PTSD who'd been suffering for 20 years, 2/3 of them met criteria for full remission from PTSD. It's a very
Two-
expensive treatment. PTSD is hard to kick. It's a very expensive treatment from a payer perspective. It's obviously debilitating for people and their families. But as this gets sort of translated into the community, it's also really hard to make sense in our current healthcare model because we're so accustomed to prescribing drugs once a day, right? Or maybe there's some, short-term psychotherapy or some sort of support. But this is upfront has a different sort of return on the investment from a payer perspective. It costs more going in. There's more of an upfront investment. And so it may be seen as a later line treatment for refractory conditions. I think it's very likely that the FDA will approve drugs like MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder in the next few years, psilocybin or psilocybin analogs for the treatment of depression, treatment-resistant depression in the next few years. But what that actually looks like remains to be seen. Another problem is the founder's problem, which is that a lot of these trials are run by people who believe it's going to work, who tell the participant when they come in the door, this is going to work for you. And because even though it's a double-blind trial, one of the problems with psychedelics is that everybody who gets it, there's a strong chance that you're gonna know that you got it. It's a psychotropic psychedelic medication. So we try to blind these trials with things like giving an active placebo rather than a sugar pill. Nevertheless, most people in these treatment arms believe correctly that they got whether or not they got the right medication, and most of the providers who are also blinded also guess correctly. And so there's this. It's not truly placebo controlled, even with active placebos, like when you give people Ritalin or niacin or a lower dose of the drug. They still are more likely to correctly guess that they were in the quote treatment arm, and that means that they get all the placebo effect. And we know that placebo is the greatest thing in medicine since the time of Paracelsus. I mean, we know that placebo, more than any other drug, is what helps people get better. It's just placebo plus the effect of the drug is the total effect of medicine. And so if you know that if you know that you got something that's going to work, you think it's going to work, and then it works, it's a little bit hard to claim with scientific rigor. And so this is, you go to these like clinical trial methodology conferences and people talk morning, noon, and night about these problems, but and there's been a lot of sophisticated thinking about how to limit that. And the FDA and the EMA and other regulatory bodies are very much aware of that. And yet it still poses a potential concern that we are just, giving people something that we tell them that will work and they believe it.
Got it. And yeah, I could see that being a particularly hard challenge to overcome, especially this kind of category. Tell me a little bit about where you think this is going to be. You mentioned PTSD already, so let's talk about where we see the most promising breakthroughs, where health plans and risk-bearing entities and providers could potentially see an impact on what they're doing with their consumers, members that they're covering in what I would say the not so distant future.
Yeah. So in the sort of like not too distant future, the current state is as follows. The FDA has approved what's called breakthrough therapy designation, BTD, for 3 different tracks of drugs, 2 for psilocybin for depression and treatment-resistant depression, and 1 for MDMA for this treatment of severe PTSD. The phase 3 trial. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
MDMA and psilocybin, could you make sure for the audience they know the difference a little bit, high level?
Yeah. So psilocybin is in all the trials. It's synthetically, made, but it's the same active ingredient in magic mushrooms, which have been used on the 6 inhabited continents for a long time, as far as we can tell. MDMA is sometimes, and this is, on the street or in recreational naturalistic setting, it's sometimes called ecstasy or Molly. It was used actually therapeutically up through the 70s and 80s, and then later scheduled. But it's people in these trials were using it at moderate to high doses to help in different ways with psychotherapy. They're very different classes of drugs, like psilocybin and LSD are considered classical hallucinogens or classical psychedelics, whereas MDMA is a phenethylamine. And there are hundreds of psychedelic compounds that are being explored and investigated, and they're not all of the same chemical class. So there's meaningful differences between them. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I didn't mean to take you completely off track with your mindset, but I just wanted to make sure that we're level
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
technical topic. So you were talking a little bit about some of the breakthroughs, and you had 2 tracks for psilocybin and 1 track for MDMA, and then I interrupted.
Yeah. So in a recent New England Journal of Medicine article, there was a head-to-head comparison between psilocybin therapy for the treatment of depression, major depressive disorder, versus the leading gold standard treatment, Lexapro or escitalopram. And in this trial, they found that psilocybin was at least as good as escitalopram. On the majority of measures, it outperforms escitalopram as a treatment for depression. And so this is actually the highest hurdle, which is like go against the existing gold standard and try to outperform Lexapro. It may also be beneficial for different people. And it may also, what's interesting about some of the psychedelic effects is that we're seeing in our research at NYU. So we treated people with anxiety and depression associated with having cancer, life-threatening diagnosis. We see that some of these benefits may last up to a year, or even in our long-term follow-up, 4 years. So it's a sort of experience where some people are taking 1 or 2 medicine sessions with supportive therapy, and they're getting a benefit, not like with ketamine for a few days to a few weeks, or with SSRIs, where once you discontinue treatment, basically you tend to have a return to the norm. But some people have benefits for months, and so we have durable benefits. And so this, instead of being an ongoing chronic treatment, will likely be an acute treatment or an acute intermittent treatment with hopefully longer term durable benefits up to 6 months or even a year, which changes the pharmacoeconomics from a payer perspective and changes also the regulatory structure from an FDA or other regulatory body perspective.
Let me ask you just a question. So Lexapro is a SSRI, as many listening may know, but not everyone maybe. It's an Allergan product. There's other obviously major pharma companies producing SSRIs, and now we've got sort of this disruptor potentially in the entire category. What is your sense on the pressures that researchers like you may be feeling from sort of the commercial side of the pharma business? Or is there any? Or am I just kind of...
Oh yeah, so there's both potential and pressure. So the potential is that SSRIs, I mean, basically from a pharma, there hasn't really been a new type of treatment approved for depression in 20 years. And depression is still the largest global mental health burden in the world. And so something that we're doing is actually not helping. And it's associated with people who are super utilizers of treatment, people who show up. When I used to work in New York City ERs, in the psych ER, like people come in and, there's all sorts of, there's comorbid diagnosis, including anxiety, depression, panic. One of the promising things about psychedelics is that potentially they get to root causes rather than suppressing or just managing symptoms. And so there's a change, as you put it with your friend. For some people, there seems to be meaningful long-term benefit. From a payer perspective, some of the pressures from an industry side and some of the challenges is that, okay, well, what we need to if psychedelics are going to get legalized, you need to move from a few thousand people we've run training programs, right? There's a few thousand people who are trained to do this, to 30,000 providers. And there's already a shortage of, in the United States at least, mental health providers, psychologists, psychotherapists, licensed clinical social workers, counselors, psychiatrists, psych NPs. The other problem is that, from a pharmacoeconomic perspective, how do you scale this to either fit within the existing healthcare architecture or to, adapt the existing healthcare architecture to provide these sorts of experiences? So SSRIs, while they don't, the STAR-D trial shows that they don't even work for 2/3 of the people on the first try, and they might be actually most efficacious for people with severe depression. Nevertheless, they're as cheap as water, right? Generic SSRIs to prescribe. They're very inexpensive. and you can do medication management with, with relatively low cost per person, even though there are some sort of externality costs to look at. When you do the pharmacoeconomic analysis for psychedelic treatments, everything's different because the upfront costs are higher, but the downstream costs could be lower. Or at least that is the argument that is being made. So the upfront costs are higher because you have to screen people, make sure they're appropriate, and then you have to have them. And the FDA is currently requiring that you work with 2 providers in the room. One of them has to be a licensed psychotherapist of some stripe, and the other one has to have some, at least it could be a paraprofessional, but they have some level of training. They have to have a year's worth of experience in a mental health facility of some sort. They don't have to have a licensure. So when you're doing preparatory sessions or providing either psychedelic therapy or psychological support, and then you have sessions afterward to try to integrate that experience, to have the person tell the story, help make meaning of it, and then translate those into new behaviors, goals, objectives for sustained benefit. That psychotherapy or a psychological support model, and it's more expensive. When you actually do the math, at least in our talks with pharmacoeconomic analytics folks, it probably works out. And from an NHS perspective or European socialized healthcare models, it may work out from a bang for your buck kind of perspective in the long run, if indeed it works for people in the long run. But your upfront costs are higher. So likely you're going to see initial approvals for, later line treatments rather than first line treatments.
So what about, has there been any studies around how this category of medication could impact, you mentioned comorbidities and you mentioned other mental health comorbidities, but what about comorbidities tied to, let's say, cardiometabolic disease? So, so often diabetes, for instance, especially type 2 diabetes, is associated with depression.
Right.
And has there been any studies around just comorbidities with both, let's say, depression, anxiety, or a related disorder, and a cardiometabolic disorder? And what's maybe the impact there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. There are some potential medical treatments. One of the main hypotheses for why psychedelics work is that actually psychedelics are some of the strongest anti-inflammatory drugs we know of. And so they're being used in some veterinary medicine. And there's a very interesting trial by Professor Nichols looking at the antidepressant tied to anti-inflammation properties. And inflammation is associated with a variety of medical and mental health problems in the body. The problem or the challenge is that if you take them, you have a psychedelic experience. So there's a big movement towards, can we have some of the anti-inflammatory properties of psychedelics, but divorce them from the psychedelic effects? There are treatments for psilocybin and other treatments for things like cluster headaches or really severe migraines. And so there's like a look at that. Some look at Fragile X syndrome, I'm not as familiar with. Some look at, and we see this in our psilocybin trials, some anecdotal reports of people losing a lot of weight, like treatments for anxiety and obesity, and other potentially like metabolically related, mental health related, comorbid disorders. I will say I'm a psychologist, I'm not a physician, so I don't want to speak out of my wheelhouse, except to say that we do know that the RDoC framework that the NIH is proposing suggests that these are underlying transdiagnostic mechanisms. When we look at the epidemic of loneliness and isolation in the United States, it's associated not just with anxiety and depression for people, but it's associated with metabolic problems, including morbidity, includes heart disease, and higher rates of mortality and morbidity, lower daily adjusted life years. So these things are intertwined in complex ways, and sort of, we don't want to play whack-a-mole, right? Like, it makes no sense to like tackle anxiety and not tackle some of the structural factors, especially for people that are walking through the door, or to deal with, to give somebody, heart medication for hypertension, but not manage some of the other things that are going on for them.
So, okay, so there's potential promise, but not a lot of we're not there yet with any sort of hardcore studies just yet.
That's right. Yeah.
You mentioned Professor Nichols. Can you give some context for people who grab names and Google them?
Yeah. Nichols has been studying the anti-inflammatory properties of psychedelics, not to be confused with his um, father, Dave Nichols, who's sort of a famous chemist at Purdue, who's done a lot of psychedelic research. But if you're interested in, I think that they've been doing, and this has become kind of an emerging field to look at the anti-inflammatory properties of psychedelics, which might be a sort of an herb hypothesis or an underlying mechanism for benefit.
So the Professor Nichols that, or is it Nichols or Nicholas? Nichols.
Nichols, Nichols.
And what the one that you're referring to, not his father, what's the first name? Is it Charles?
Yeah, Charles Nichols. His father's Dave Nichols.
Okay, so Charles Nichols. So I think he's LSU, if my Googling.
Yeah, that's right. He's in Louisiana.
Okay, right. Beautiful. What else about the promise here as it relates to what I mean, you obviously hit upon the pharmacoeconomics potential impact for any kind of risk-bearing organization that's what's dealing with the costs associated. Anything else about sort of the progress you're seeing that you want everyone to learn about and get excited about sort of before we close up here?
Yeah, I just want to address directly. There's been obviously a lot of stigma associated with psychedelics. When I used to give talks to residents in medical school, I think my first talk was in 2005, and it was, all the questions were like spinal cord damage, risk for psychosis, how dangerous are these drugs? And a lot of that has been fed by a campaign of misinformation that started with signing of the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, the war on drugs, some of which, there's good reason to be afraid of certain drugs or to not want people on them. But psychedelics were kind of swept up in that from the anti-war movement and the anti-hippie movement and a lot of racialized political work in the 70s. When we're actually seeing is that large scale meta analyses of thousands of administrations in leading research institutes like our trials at Yale and NYU and our colleagues at Hopkins and Imperial and around the world is that these can be given relatively safely without serious adverse events, without persistent adverse events. And one of the things that we're looking at is that our mental health landscape has been broken for a long time. It does not really work for most people. We all know somebody in our family or our neighborhood or in our close circle who's really suffering, oftentimes silently, with the effects of depression, anxiety, trauma, addiction. And the current treatments tend not to work as well as we would like. They tend not to work for as long as we would like. They tend to have pretty difficult side effects for a lot of people. I believe that the preponderance of evidence suggests that this is a promising treatment. And so we will see what pans out in the end and what gets approved and how it actually looks and translates into our architecture. But I think that psychedelics, if you've been on the fence, or if you've heard a few podcasts, or if you've been listening to me and thinking, well, maybe there's something to this, take a look at the evidence base. I think we can dispel some of the myths and also, embrace the fact that these are different than other classes of drugs. And so they will be a challenge for us to implement. It's not going to be the same old formulary. We have to think critically about how to do this together. And I think it's going to require some upfront investment. I hope that doesn't impede their potential implementation, because I have seen firsthand in working with patients who I didn't think were going to get better in the short term, having truly remarkable benefit. Really, really having, these are not panaceas or cures, but people that I didn't think were going to, get a lot better. We ran, ketamine trials, for example, in the ER with people with severe suicidality. And my colleagues found that people who came in could barely speak, couldn't tie their shoes. By the end, the woman was, after the ketamine treatment, like sitting up, chatting with people, putting her purse on her shoulder, putting lipstick on, tying her shoes, and able to function the way that she would have wanted to have functioned when she came through that door. And I've seen this sort of thing firsthand, and we'll see what happens, but I'm excited for the potential and prospect for these in the future. The evidence remains to be generated, but we'll see where it goes.
It's great. I really enjoyed learning a lot from you in preparation for this, Alex. I know I mentioned your website, alexbelser.com. Anywhere else people can find you, reach out to you?
Yeah, all my socials are on Linktree, alex.belser. It's good to talk with you folks, and thanks for listening. It's thanks for having me on, Eric. I appreciate it.
No problem. Tell me how the next couple of months go, and I'd love to have you back on as kind of progress and new results come down the pike, just to hear as we advance this sort of category, and hopefully in many ways help try to reinvent this entire area as we treat of illnesses above the neck. I want to just remind everyone, we have these so often in healthcare, these hopelessly complex problems. Rather than looking for these massive sort of solutions, these massive covers to fill these massive holes, use the strategy of finding bright spots. Let's say maybe in a couple of areas of mental health tied to psychedelics, find these bright spots that are working well among the chaos and use them to solve bigger problems at your organization and make healthcare better for everyone around the country and around the world. We hope we use the bright spots shared and some of the promises shared today during today's episode to inspire your thinking and enhance your organization's current approach to improving healthcare for everyone. We produce this show for you. This is your Bright Spots in Healthcare podcast. Until next time, take care, everyone.